Good evening. Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, our special guest this evening, Professor Stephen Hanson and Professor Stevenson, Ambassador Carlton Davis, Ambassador Derek Heaven, Distinguished Ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago, senior members of staff, Pro-Vice-Chancellors, principals, deans, professors, students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another interesting presentation in our series. Today we are having a program which runs as follows. The Vice-Chancellor will give a welcoming opening remark. This will be followed by a lecture by Professor Stephen Hanson, and the topic of that lecture is the novelty of Putin's patrimonialism, analyzing Russian regime change, a most current and interesting topic given all that is going on in the news media. His presentation will be followed by two short comments by our distinguished discussants. And then we'll have question and answers. Sir Hilary Beckles needs no introduction, especially in this arena, but I think I should introduce our speaker and the discussants. Professor Stephen Hanson, Vice Provost for International Affairs at the College of William and Mary, Director of the Reves Center for International Studies, and a professor in the Department of Government. He did his first degree at Harvard University and his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of 3 books, and I understand a 4th is forthcoming shortly, centered around Russian political system and authoritarian tendencies in various European systems. He held a number of posts in the University of Washington, Harvard University, Oxford University, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He's a specialist in Russian history and Russian contemporary affairs, and I'm sure you'll be very interested in what he has to say. I had the benefit of speaking with him this morning, and you're in for an education. Our discussants, Ambassador Carlton Davis. Ambassador Carlton Davis is the former Cabinet Secretary of Jamaica. He is the former Executive Director of the Jamaica Bauxite Institute, and he completed his PhD in soil chemistry at the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine. He has written 3 books on the bauxite industry in Jamaica, and it is his expertise and experience in trading bauxite with first the Soviet Union and later with Russia, which he brings to this, as well as his general encyclopedic knowledge of international affairs. Ambassador Derek Heaven, former Minister of Government, former Member of Parliament, former Executive Chair of the Sugar Industry Authority, and former Ambassador of Jamaica to the United Kingdom, Japan, and China. He had the distinction of leading the first mission by the Jamaican government to the Soviet Union, and the rest is history. Both of these distinguished gentlemen hold one of the highest orders that can be awarded in Jamaica, the Order of Jamaica. Having said all of that, I wish to welcome you all here this evening and to invite our distinguished Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, to make an opening remark.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernal, Professor Hanson, Professor Stevenson, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. Very good evening, everyone. A few months ago, I was guest of Professor Hanson at William and Mary, and I can assure you the hospitality he extended to me was beyond first class. He was absolutely remarkable, and he and his colleagues, not only in the academic sense of generosity, but also in a social sense of collegiality. And we had many wonderful discussions, including comparative discourses around the role of the Soviet Union in the liberation of Africa and in the third world struggles for freedom generally from the 60s through to the 80s and 90s, and comparing that with some of the movements today in the global politics and where some of these countries are in relation to those same conversations now that the Soviet Union has, or Russia has once again come very close into our spaces. He is an expert in this field on the post-Soviet Russia, the post-communist Russian world, and how the ideologies governing Russia's foreign policies and many of the other engagements in the world are taking shape. We are very keen to hear from experts in this area. The Caribbean world, no doubt, has a very keen interest in understanding where many of these trends are going and what are the philosophies that are driving these. And I thought it therefore appropriate to invite Professor Hanson to come to the Vice-Chancellor's Forum and to share with us here in our university, in our region and beyond, his research, and to give us some insights into helping us to comprehend Russia in the age of Trump. So it really is a tremendous honor and pleasure for me, Professor Hanson, to welcome you to the University of the West Indies.
Sir Hilary, Ambassador Bernal, Your Excellencies, distinguished audience members, it really is my honor to be here at the University of West Indies. It is beyond my expectations, and I had very high expectations coming. Similarly, everyone here has treated us with such wonderful hospitality, and my wife and I do really appreciate it. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks reasonably contained. It'll only be 3 hours. No, I'm kidding. 30 minutes. And I'm going to try in that time to tell you why we misunderstand Russia a lot, at least in the United States and in my field of Russian studies. And some of this will go back to my training, which was actually in Sovietology. I'm old enough now that I was a Sovietologist for a very short time. My PhD from Berkeley was 1991. So I had a few months to be a Sovietologist before the Soviet Union collapsed. And I actually tell people I think I was the very last Sovietologist created in the United States before I got hired. And I had to change and become a Russia specialist. But that training is now quite relevant, and I'll tell you why. It's because we've gotten back to a way of thinking about Russia that reminds me a lot of things that I was dealing with as a graduate student studying the Soviet Union. Back in the 1980s, before Gorbachev came to power, and even a little bit after, the dominant theory of Soviet politics was that it was stuck, that it was, bureaucratically ossified. The Soviet Union was tyrannical in a way that could never really be changed, certainly not from within. The so-called continuity thesis, as Professor Stephen Cohen has called it, that is, that really Russia has been the same entity, maybe from the Tsarist period to the Soviet period, was the dominant point of view. And of course, that led us astray, because when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, suddenly things changed very, very quickly, and the West was caught unawares with this notion that nothing could ever change, Russian history would always be the same. By 1991, it was very clear to everybody that that was far from the case. In 7 years, the entire system collapsed in a way that nobody predicted. My first trip to the Soviet Union was in 1986, so I got there just in time to see the thing start to fall apart. So I'm very attuned to the question, when does something that looks very stable change suddenly? Well, if we come to the present day and we look at Putin's Russia, we discover that once again, the dominant ways of thinking about Russia in the United States are still based on the continuity thesis. 3 big views, which kind of lead us to the same conclusion that Russia is stuck, that it doesn't change. The first point of view, probably the most common one, is that the best way to think of Putin is as a czar, that Putin is the new czar of Russia, And in this respect, Putin is very similar to previous Russian leaders or even Soviet leaders. Stalin could be thought of as a czar like this. Obviously, the czars of the Romanov dynasty, all the way back to Peter the Great, or even earlier to Ivan the Terrible. And this is kind of a dominant notion of Russia that you hear a lot in the public media, and you hear it among ordinary people who will say, yeah, you know, Putin is another of the czars. Russia always likes czars. They keep putting them back in power again and again. And that's why nothing will ever change, because the Russians are used to czars, and Putin is still only, you know, in his 60s, so a very young man. Seems younger all the time to me, to be in your 60s. So the theory then is that there's really no source of change because the Russian political system has been this way for thousands of years. And there's a second point of view, which really focuses not so much on Putin as a czar or as the myth of a ruler like that, but instead comes from the theory of rational choice. And that says the reason Putin's in charge is basically it's rational to follow his orders. Right? If you follow his orders loyally, and if you're at the top, you can make billions of dollars, literally billions. And if you don't follow his orders, or if you actually disobey and you're at the top, you can end up not surviving for very long. And so as a result of that, you know, if you make the calculation of cost-benefit analysis, you say, I think I will obey the order. So from this point of view, you can look at Putin as a kind of big boss, and as the patron of an entire system of client relations, where everybody has an incentive to follow the center because it's just so risky not to do so. To oppose the regime is extremely difficult, and to go along does pay some benefits. The problem with this theory is it also leads us to a notion of continuity, because that's very much how Yeltsin ruled before Putin. That's really how the Soviet leaders ruled in many ways. It was also very irrational to oppose Soviet rulers. It was in your interest to follow the party in the communist period, and it was in your interest to obey the Tsar's orders in the Tsarist period. So the most sort of well-known people who look at Russia this way will say, Russia's always kind of had one big boss, and it's been rational to follow that boss, and so again, nothing's really ever changed, and by the way, that's the same situation all over the former Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, for that matter, Georgia or Belarus, you could see some of the same tendencies in place. One boss may leave, but the other boss comes in. Finally, there's a third theory out there which really focuses on Putin as what we call a sort of postmodern autocrat. And this theory says what's most distinctive about Russia today is that it is the master of fake news. The Russian regime survives by creating myths, by flooding the media with crazy stories, by confusing audiences so that you don't even know what to oppose because people can't really get their head around what's true or what's not true. There are all sorts of classic dirty tricks that are used in Russian politics. In the early 90s, when they started to run elections, you'd suddenly discover, if your name was, let's say, Sergei Ivanov, a very common name, that there would be 5 other people named Sergei Ivanov on the ballot. You didn't know about them before, but then the voter can't figure out which one is you and which one is the other one. And so these kinds of dirty tricks started to become more and more refined to the point where now we see a kind of global version of this. Russia, quite obviously, this is not even in question, but they do intervene in elections to try to confuse audiences, to try to support candidates they favor, particularly candidates who oppose particular foreign policies, such as NATO expansion or sanctions against the Russian regime. So there are a couple of well-known authors. Peter Pomerantsev wrote a book called In Russia, Everything is Possible and Nothing is True, which more or less makes this kind of argument. But here's the thing. The same people who argue that Putin should be understood as the purveyor of fake news par excellence also say that's been true throughout Russian history. They'll say in the 1990s, as I already mentioned, manipulation of politics and democracy was very widespread. Of course, the Soviet Union had been the purveyors of propaganda and misinformation, for a very long time. In fact, Putin himself comes from the KGB, as you know, in his early training, and KGB agents were trained to produce this kind of disinformation that would confuse audiences and maybe lead astray people who would otherwise oppose Russian interests. And even back to the Tsarist period, historically, you can find episodes where the servants of the Tsar tried to please the Tsar by creating fake news, in effect. The most famous being the so-called Potemkin villages, when Catherine the Great was the Tsar. No one wanted to show Catherine the Great that the peasants were actually very poor, so they created these model villages on the Volga River, and when she came by, she would see happy peasants and beautiful houses, all praising the Tsar's name. So that's fake news too, right? It goes back all the way to the 18th century, if you look at it like that. So here's where we are today. We have a theory that says Putin is a Tsar, and that's been true forever in Russia. We have a theory that says it's rational to follow Putin as the boss, and that's been true forever in Russia. And we have a third theory that says Putin is the master of all the disinformation, and that's been true forever in Russia. Strangely enough, all three of these views lead us to the same conclusion: Russia never changes. Russia's always the same thing. Maybe it's all three. It's a kind of czarist regime with a big boss with a lot of fake news. All right, so you can probably see where I'm headed with this. You set it up to say there's something wrong with this picture here. If all we have are theories that tell us that Russia's never changing, we don't have a lot of tools for understanding what might change, or when it might change, or how to encourage such change. And let me suggest that beyond just the fact that these three theories all predict continuity, they miss pretty important elements of the Russian experience over the last 100 years. Here we are in the year 2017. It's exactly 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And in that period, Russia went from a country that was about 85% peasants to a country that is today about 90% urban. There's really not much of a countryside left in Russia. Russia went from a country with mass illiteracy and very big problems with education to a universally literate and educated, highly educated population. Russia today is the 12th biggest economy in the world. Okay, it's not the 5th or the 6th, but 12th is nothing to sneeze at. This is an important player in global relations. And that changed from 100 years ago to today. It's certainly not true of the late Tsarist period that Russia was an economic power of the same measure. So why do we have theories that only predict continuity when under the surface of that, over the last century, Russia has arguably gone through greater social change than any country on the planet? Imagine going from a peasant society to a highly industrial one, not in 100 years, but in about 30, and having Stalin be the guy pushing this at the cost of tens of millions of lives, and creating an urban industrial economy that is now very much part of the center of the world economically. Plus, we have all of those times when Russia didn't obey the Tsar. From Gorbachev's arrival in 1985 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then all the way up to Putin's appointment as Yeltsin's heir in 1999, Russia went through quite the opposite. Not strong central authority, but decentralized, almost chaotic transition. Democracy too much, some would argue. Votes all over the place, many of them with problems, but nevertheless votes that had consequences. Zyuganov, the Communist Party leader, ran against Boris Yeltsin in 1996 and lost. There was some manipulation of that vote, no question whatsoever. And yet, most Russians I know will tell you, yeah, but I voted for Boris Yeltsin because the other guy wanted to bring us back to the Soviet Union, and you seem totally out of touch, and I didn't want that. So Russia didn't just go from czar to czar to czar, from boss to boss to boss, from fake news to fake news to fake news. There were real social changes and political changes that have taken place. So how do we analyze this better? We need a new theory. I am a political scientist, so I'm forced to say the word theory somewhere in every lecture. Hopefully no one runs for the exits now because the theory will be mercifully brief today. But we do need a theory that somehow is more fine-grained in distinguishing the different kinds of Russian regimes that we've had. Yes, on the surface, it may look like Tsarism is the same as Soviet rule is the same as Putin's rule. But I would argue, and I will, that there are rather remarkable differences underneath that. But to understand it, we have to understand how authority is legitimated, not just in Russia, but in the world. What matters isn't just the structure of power. Is there one boss or a democratically elected president or a prime minister? What matters is why people think they should obey the boss. What is the reason in their mind that they think there's legitimacy to the orders that they're being given? Because, as Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, told us 100 years ago, without legitimacy for the boss, not much gets done. State authority depends on having agents. You have to instruct them what to do, and they have to say not just, if I do this, I get paid, or if I do this, I don't get killed. At least some of them have to think, I better carry this out in the interests of the state, or because I really think it's a good thing to do morally, or because the boss has a reason to give me that order and I actually believe in him or her. In other words, legitimacy among those who carry out power really matters for state strength. And that great insight from Weber helps us quite a lot in understanding how to look at Russia over the last 100 years. I'll give you one more piece of theory before we move on from it. Max Weber also had a key insight about the nature of legitimacy, which is that really when you look at human history, there are only three real reasons why anybody thinks they should obey political authority as a duty. not just as a self-interest. One of them is he called tradition, which is you do it because this is the way we've always done it in our community. This is the tradition of our people. This is the inherited religious tradition. In other words, traditional authority is by far the most common, and the most common example we all know is parental authority. When your father tells you to do something, go mow the lawn or go clean the kitchen, you don't say, under what constitutional authority do you have the right to tell me that? Hopefully, if you're a good child, you say, yes, father, or yes, mother, because it works pretty well with mothers as well. And that actually is a model for political authority that's very important. We shouldn't discard it even in the 21st century. There are some examples in the post-Soviet space, Azerbaijan comes to mind, where it's directly parental authority that matters. The father, Aliyev, passed away, the son Aliyev took over as president of Azerbaijan, and that kind of lineage or dynasty does exist. And there have been rumors about that in other post-Soviet states as a way of having political authority be transferred from one leader to another. So familial lineages do matter quite a lot in politics. They still matter. I would guess they will always matter until we're replaced by the robots. I suppose at that point it might stop. So that's the first type. Second type is, Weber had a terrible German word for it. He called it rational legal authority. Not very easy to say, but what he meant by it was simply the idea that authority can be legitimated if you believe it's rooted in some kind of legal framework. If it's rooted in some rational discourse, which allows you to see the reasons behind the order that you're being given. Classic forms include constitutional democracy, in which the president can give an order or the prime minister because the rules of the system have given that person an office. It's not the person who should be obeyed, it's the office in principle, and bureaucracy more generally should work like that. And then finally, only one other type of authority that can be legitimate, according to Weber, and that he called charismatic authority. Charismatic authority is when you believe the person giving you the order has God's will behind him, or can change the world magically, or create a revolution that will transform human nature. If you believe the person giving you an order is like that, you obey. And you obey not just out of a sense of interest. You obey because this is a duty to something higher than you, higher than anybody. Now, charismatic authority is very rare. It comes along only once in a while, in times of big crisis usually, but when it does come along, it can transform things much more dramatically in a direction people can't anticipate. Because mobilized people who obey the leader because he or she is God's authority on earth, they're really going to change things and sacrifice quite a lot. But it doesn't necessarily last that long. That type of authority tends to be ephemeral because people follow, but then the miracles stop, or they start to have doubts, or the person dies and the son doesn't seem very charismatic. All of these happen a lot in history, then charismatic authority tends to collapse. In about 5 minutes, I gave you a very helpful theory. You can analyze any political regime with these three types of legitimation. Now let me tell you why that's useful for understanding Russia's history and Russia today. If you look at the Soviet Union, in 1917, coming out of the Tsarist regime. This was not a Tsarist regime anymore. The Soviet Union was built on a charismatic promise. We forget it now because time has moved on. It's a quarter century after the collapse of communism. But at the time Lenin came to power and Trotsky and Bukharin and all the other supporters of the Soviet cause in the early 20th century, they genuinely believed that their revolution was going to transform all of the planet, all of human nature, that there would be a brand new kind of social order on the planet that the Soviet Union would lead. And people who believed that followed not because of self-interest only, though that was there, but also because they felt they were building a new world order. If you look at the early communist leaderships of any country, if you look at Mao Zedong getting trained in the Comintern, or if you look at leaders in Vietnam or wherever you look, you'll find true believers, people who joined early in their life, who sacrificed a lot, who were arrested. Stalin we think of as just a kind of tyrant, and of course he was. He was also arrested 6 times prior to the Bolshevik Party taking power in 1917. For doing various activities that were considered revolutionary. And he went to jail a few times. I mean, this was not an easy path to power. It wasn't obvious in the 1910s that the best way to become a dictator was to follow this guy Lenin, who, by the way, wasn't even in Russia. He was in Switzerland at the time. And to read all of his books carefully and impress him with your theoretical knowledge of Marxism. I mean, none of that seemed like a path to power until that group actually did take power and they began to transform the Soviet Union and then the world. From 1917 until 1991, this is the incredible thing, that whole 74-year period of Soviet rule, the charismatic promise of communism was never formally abandoned. It remained an inspiration, certainly through Khrushchev. As late as Khrushchev, the Soviet Union was claiming that full communism would be built in the Soviet society by 1980, which of course they had to change later. About 1983, they changed the party platform because it was difficult to argue they were already in full communism. But having said that, it's amazing that they could even make the promise. I mean, imagine today President Trump or President Obama before him saying, the United States will become a utopia with perfect harmony by 2020, and that's my platform. I mean, they kept saying those kinds of things, and people did sort of believe it. If you go to the archives, you'll discover, and this is quite remarkable, that even behind closed doors, Soviet leaders were using the jargon of Marxism-Leninism, the notion of communism as something worth building. And even Gorbachev himself. It's true, people became more cynical by the 1980s, when the Soviet Union started to grind down, when alcoholism became much more rampant, when corruption began to spread, and when Reagan and Thatcher came to power promising a renewed kind of capitalist order. But even at that point, the notion was somehow to find a way to reform socialism, not just to abandon it and become a capitalist country. I would argue even Gorbachev himself, in his hopeless efforts to revitalize socialism, was a true believer. He thought somehow by creating glasnost, perestroika, and change, he would revitalize the enthusiasm for the charismatic mission, the promise of communism that he'd grown up with as a boy. If that's right, that means 1991 was a real change in Russian politics. The collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a transformation from one kind of boss to another kind of boss, but the end of a charismatic empire and the beginning of something maybe a little more normal for the 21st century, something we understand. And that's Boris Yeltsin. So Boris Yeltsin, who came to power in 1991, as you know, who was really the first Russian leader to be democratically elected in Russia. He actually stood for election and won. He was, from the Weberian point of view, basing his legitimacy on constitutional law. Now, he did so in a way that wasn't very successful. For one thing, he was drunk quite a lot. That's a fact. He wrote about it in his own memoirs, so I'm not, casting aspersions, but he just liked to drink. And that created some problems for the notion of democracy in Russia in the 1990s because people saw their democratically elected, legally legitimate president doing things like showing up in Ireland and conducting, this was in Germany, forgive me. In Germany, he decided to get off the plane and conduct the band that had been put there for him. So when he arrived, he grabbed the batons and started going like, quite inebriated. It was in Ireland, he actually slept through a meeting with the Prime Minister of Ireland that he was supposed to do, and they couldn't get him off the plane. And so this matters because in the 1990s, Russians were being told, congratulations, you have a wonderful new European-style democracy, but then your boss is out there making a fool of himself. And all the Russians I know who are educated were really embarrassed by it and said, well, if this is democracy, I'm not sure what we think of it. Your President Clinton kind of talks about our guy as if he's wonderful, but what we see is this buffoon. In addition, of course, that was the period of the massive collapse of the Soviet economy, which lost 50% of GDP, maybe more, some estimates would have it, in a 10-year period. And having been to Russia a lot in the 1990s, I can tell you that the pain was quite real. It wasn't just the end of inefficient Soviet enterprises. It was also people's loss of jobs. People who'd been managers in Soviet industry, who'd been at the top of their profession, now found themselves jobless, being lectured to by 25-year-old PhDs from Harvard who'd come and tell them how to organize their economy better. And now being in my 50s, I really understand you don't want 25-year-olds lecturing you very much. No offense to the 25-year-olds in the audience. But this just made a very natural bad impression on Russia. They associated this so-called rational legal constitutional order with all of these declines, all of this marginalization, all of these lectures. And I'll add a last point. If you looked at popular media in the United States in the 1990s about Russia, Russians were the only villains left. Everybody else organized, so you didn't want to make them the villain because people would get angry. Properly so. But Russians had no lobby, and so every villain in every single television show or movie was Russian for about most of the decade. They were mafiosis, they were corrupt, they were proto-Soviet, You'll remember The World Is Not Enough, a James Bond movie from that period. I use that for Jamaican references because I guess there's a Bond-Jamaica connection. And in that movie, the Soviet kind of Russian elites are selling ICBMs for a pair of Nike sneakers, this kind of. And so Russians, educated people, as I've mentioned, are watching this depiction of their own society and getting angry, of course. Over the course of 10 years, you're being told, congratulations, you got rid of communism, now you have Western democracy, and this is how you're portrayed. It used to be when Soviet leaders walked into the room, the entire world trembled, everybody cared. Now in the 1990s, and I admit I have a few scars myself as a Russia specialist in the period. You'd go into rooms and say, I'm a specialist on Russia, Russia really matters. And people would say, oh, you must be one of those Sovietologists. Haven't you moved on? I had arguments with people in the 1990s that Russia would not exist in 20 years because of the demographic crisis and the decline of the economy. It would just mean Russia would fall apart completely. So Russians did get upset. We only have 2 more stages in our tale before we get to the present. Am I doing okay? Okay, good. So I like to check, because people are like 2 stages left. All right. So then we have Putin. Now we're getting to Putin. Yeltsin, in the last term, and he's really getting quite sick. He realizes that his own family, which has made a lot of money, by the way, in this privatization period, all Soviet assets are being handed over to various well-connected elites, the so-called oligarchs. Russians are very angry, but still hopeful somehow that the system can stabilize. And he finds Vladimir Putin, who's been connected with the Yeltsin family for quite some time, and Yeltsin's group, beginning when Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg under a Yeltsin ally by the name of Sobchak. And for a while, Putin was the property manager in the Kremlin, so he had a lot of ties to people who knew who had what. And of course, the KGB training didn't hurt, because if you want to get people in line in a hurry and clean up the mess, then here's a guy who's got the training and the discipline to do it. And so Putin is named for all of those reasons, and quickly turns out to be a quite remarkable politician. But here's what I want to say about the change of legitimacy from Yeltsin to Putin. At the beginning, Putin still claimed this rational, legal kind of legitimacy. Not entirely did he move over to some kind of czar-like portrayal of himself. In fact, the whole transition from Yeltsin to Putin was justified as the first democratic transition in the history of Russia. That's how people said it. At the time, there were great, sort of praise being given to Yeltsin for stepping down. Yes, he did it about 6 months before the end of his second term, but nevertheless, it was a peaceful transfer of power. There was an election. By that point, Putin had already been put in the office, so it was a little bit skewed. But indeed, Russians did pick Putin, and they did. He was very, very popular. 47 years old instead of the aging Yeltsin. Fairly good about his alcohol consumption. To this day, he does not overdo it. And as you know, he keeps himself fit. He goes to the gym every day. That's true, by the way, several hours. And so you have a guy who, can claim that he's really a president of a different sort. But the notion of the legitimacy of his rule doesn't shift at the beginning. What happens over time, though, is that Putin becomes increasingly worried that nothing will change in the West in terms of attitudes toward Russia. And ordinary Russians are still very angry at the West for the mistreatment that they saw in the 1990s, as I mentioned before. And so Putin, with a bit of a conspiratorial mindset, it's true, starts interpreting the world as everyone up against Russia. And that becomes very clear even as early as 9/11. Putin was the first foreign leader to call President George W. Bush after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York to pledge solidarity with the United States. He used the hotline that had been set up with the Soviet Union to call and say, we're with you, we want to fight the terrorists. The response was almost nothing from the Bush administration, not because people didn't want to help Russia, but because it was just such a low priority. No one was really thinking about it. And by the time the State of the Union address was given that January after 9/11 in 2002, the only mention of Russia was within kind of an offhand line about how we're cooperating in new ways with countries like China and Russia. And that was it, the only mention. Putin and a lot of the Russian elite were waiting for the moment where the United States president would say, Russia, we are so grateful for your support in the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and we stand with you shoulder to shoulder. None of that language happened. Instead, NATO continued to expand. Russia continued to be a very low priority. And the anger that Putin felt along with a lot of the Russian population only simmered and got worse. This is not to say that Putin wasn't autocratic in some tendencies at the beginning, but what I want to emphasize is that for the first term, you could still argue he was the democratically elected president with some popular legitimacy of a rational legal type. That continues all the way through Medvedev in one very strange respect, which is that Putin came to the end of his second term in 2008, and the Russian constitution that Yeltsin had created in 1993 limits the Russian president to 2 terms in office, 2 four-year terms. Now, if you're just the czar, and that's the whole story, you don't give up your position because of some dumb constitution, right? Here's the crazy thing. As late as 2008, and Putin was running everything autocratically by then, repressing opposition. Yes, all that was happening. But he chose to step down to become the prime minister instead of the president and have his prime minister become the president, Medvedev, just for 4 years. Why? It's still an interesting puzzle. Really, the answer is legitimacy. He still wanted to portray himself to his own people as a democratic ruler, not as an autocrat, as a constitutional ruler, not as a czar. So now to the fourth and final stage, where we're at today. My lecture title, as you saw, was The Novelty of Putin's Patrimonialism. Now I can finally explain what I mean by that. In 2011-2012, Putin decided to come back as president after that 4-year period of Medvedev. And it was greeted by howls of protest by Russians. By this point, young Russians, educated Russians, urban Russians said, enough with this charade. You step down from Medvedev for 4 years, then you come back 4 years later. This is getting embarrassing again. This is a little like the shenanigans that we're trying to get out of. Moreover, Putin and Medvedev made the terrible mistake of announcing to the Russian population that they had planned this all along. Both of them said, yeah, we made a deal back in 2008, we'd switcheroo, and, I'd be back. And suddenly there are hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow, of St. Petersburg. Their slogan is Россия без Путина, Russia without Putin. Well, if you're Putin and you have a little bit of a paranoid streak and you think the West is out to get you anyway, and then you see these signs, you think somebody in the CIA is paying. Where are these signs coming from? It wasn't true. There were a lot of Russians I know just out there protesting because they didn't want the idea that Putin would come back for another 2 terms. And by the way, now longer terms because they changed the constitution to make it 6-year terms instead of 4, so 2 terms is 12 years. People just didn't like that. But Putin saw the hand of the West, the hand of the CIA, and of course there were verbal support for those protests in Washington, D.C. And so he reacted by changing the basis of legitimacy. At that point, he becomes a czar. And I'll tell you several reasons why it changed. First and foremost, elections stop mattering. He manipulates the last election to come back as he'd planned to do. But at that point, no longer do you have any serious prospect for changing the leadership through elections or constitutions. The United Russia Party, which is the pro-state party, is absolutely in control of the entire political system. The next Duma elections, which happened last autumn, are, by everybody's account, the most boring elections in post-Soviet history. Nothing changed, nobody cared. Less than half the population turned out to vote. They changed the voting date to mid-September so they could have the election mostly happen in the summer. Why? Because everyone's at their dacha in August in Russia, which is their cabin, picking mushrooms, having a great time with their family. Nobody's paying any attention to politics, and that was by design. So the election is happening under the radar. It's a fake election, completely. At the same time, they're also turning against all of the forces of opposition that still existed in Russia that could organize those kinds of protests. They pass a law against the so-called foreign agents. Any non-governmental organization that is accused of receiving money from a foreign power and being political can be shut down, and a number of NGOs are done, so that happens very quickly. And of course, there's incarceration for those people who do organize protests after the 2011-2012 transition. The Orthodox Church makes a big comeback. It had already been important in the early Putin period, but since 2011, the Orthodox Church has been used much more as a source of legitimacy. This is patrimonial rule of a traditional sort, meaning more like Tsarism. The leader, Putin, is supposed to be the protector of the faith. He has church authority and, in a way, traditional religious authority behind him, which is not a big theme before 2011, but it's a huge theme now. And the Russian Orthodox Church has been empowered a lot more as a result. You have, of course, and critically, the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, along with a kind of upsurge of Russian military intervention elsewhere. And all of those moves are justified as a return to Russian imperial greatness, quite explicitly. So the term Novorossiya is created, which is an old historical reference to Catherine the Great's period, when, of course, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, when Crimea first became part of Russia. And the notion is our borders are no longer the borders of the Russian Federation, the legal, rational borders that we were assigned by the West. Our borders are the great Russian historical borders that we had when we were an empire. And that kind of trend continues in Russian media, in Russian education, in Putin's own pronouncements. So when you put these things together, that elections don't matter anymore, much more repression, Orthodox Church back, and a foreign policy based on traditional Russian imperial greatness, you can see that Putin's regime has shifted its legitimacy from elections and law to personal patrimonial control. All right, is it durable? So let me conclude by giving you 4 reasons it isn't and 1 reason it is. First, it's not too durable because there's no dynasty here. The whole point of the lecture on the novelty, I look at myself over there, the whole point of the lecture on the novelty of Putin's patrimonialism is this is about a 6-year-old project. It's not the case that thousands of years of Russian history have led us to this point and it's all the same thing. Quite the contrary. 6 years ago, Putin decided to shift the basis of legitimacy to this very old-fashioned type of legitimacy. And he has no Romanov dynasty behind him. His 2 daughters, no one mentions them as successors to Putin. When I mention that to Russians, they laugh at me. They say, Putin's daughters as the president? It's a laughable notion. So this is not that kind of dynasty. And he has no other heirs who could take over. So there's nothing really behind it other than Putin positioning himself like this, and that's a source of weakness. A second reason that it's not very durable, corruption. Massive, very, very intense corruption that continues today. The most recent protests just a few weeks ago, which took place in 100 Russian cities, tens of thousands of protesters, came in response to a video which shows Medvedev, the former president, now prime minister again, and all of his very nice mansions and his wine vineyards and his Florence villa and his yachts and his ski resort outside of Sochi. And Navalny, who's the big opposition leader who put this together, I mean, it's incredible. You should watch this video if you want to. Just Navalny video, you'll see it. What they did is they sent drones over all of the oligarchs' mansions, and nobody was shooting them down. People ask, how did they do that? The answer is if you're a rich person in Russia, you weren't really thinking about it. You know, those drones come around like kids use them. And they come around, they film. Well, now he has all this film of the most incredible luxury houses and ski resorts and yachts, and they found ways to trace them all to the prime minister. Note the cleverness of this attack. They didn't attack Putin, because that's very dangerous. They attacked Medvedev, who, you know, now Putin can't really say he's not connected to it, but he also doesn't want to say, Medvedev's my man, don't attack him, because that associates you more with that kind of corrupt figure. Russians protested across the country because the corruption is so real, so obvious, and it undermines the myth of patrimonial tsarism. How do you claim to be the father of the country and the representative of the church when people make tens of billions on your watch? Third reason it's not sustainable is the lack of a U.S. bogeyman. So we used to have Obama, we used to have Hillary Clinton, we used to have my good friend Ambassador Michael McFaul. All of them could be utilized and were all the time on Russian television as the source of the threat to Russia, as people plotting to get rid of Putin, as people plotting to expand NATO. Well, now you have President Trump. And be careful what you wish for sometimes in life, because Putin got the guy we think that he wanted, except now you can't blame things on him. If the economy goes down, or there's corruption that you see on the videos, or people are just getting tired of Putin for all these years, and you say, well, it's Donald Trump's fault? I mean, you can see that doesn't play very well. And that matters a lot, I think. I think people don't realize the extent to which using the United States and Western Europe as a kind of scary opposition made Russians rally together, and now that's ceasing to be effective. Fourth and final reason that it's not sustainable is the economy. The economic decline of the last 2 years has been quite severe, about 3.5% decline a year ago, last year about 1%. The World Bank estimates Russia will grow by 2% this year because oil prices are back a little bit and commodities in general have recovered from the depths of the post-financial crisis situation. But the pain was felt very, very severely, and sanctions do matter. They have hurt quite a lot. So that matters for the legitimacy of the state because people are wondering when it's going to pay off or if anything can ever change. And I don't know that it can because fracking technology and other new energy technologies make it a lot harder to imagine $100 a barrel oil of the sort we had not that long ago that Putin and his regime were benefiting from very, very much. Well, no dynasty behind it, huge corruption, lack of a U.S. opposition to blame, and economic decline. I think there are reasons to suspect things could change in a hurry. But before I just make a prediction, which will say, oh, once again, these Russia specialists, they make predictions, we leave, they don't happen. Let me give you the fifth reason that it may not change. And that is, it is very difficult to oppose Vladimir Putin in today's Russia. He has entrenched himself so firmly in charge of just about every state agency you can imagine, certainly the agencies of coercion, that open opposition gets you in trouble. Boris Nemtsov, the liberal figure who was shot not far from the Kremlin not that long ago, was not even that big of a threat to Putin. And whether Putin's people decided to do something about him or it was Chechens or others, we don't know. But what is clear is you can be shot within a stone's throw of the center of power, and no one will ever really find out who did it. And that's well known to Russians. So in that kind of an environment, opposition is very, very difficult, and people leave. So because Putin's so entrenched, a lot of ambitious Russians just go to Western Europe, they go to the United States, they go to other places, and that brain drain that's going on has been continuing for some time. That too makes it very difficult to organize against Putin, because the people who are most upset and most ambitious and most skilled, they may just leave the country rather than stay to fight. So those are the odds. We as political scientists can't have a crystal ball and tell you exactly, but we can give you some notion of what factors to watch, the 4 factors that lead it to something very different, the 1 factor, crucially important, that may keep it in place for quite some time. It's a novel attempt to create patrimonial rule in the 21st century, and it'll be very interesting to see which way it goes. Thank you so much.
Now going to ask the discussants to spend 10 minutes each, starting with Ambassador Carlton Davis, followed by Ambassador Derek Heaven, and then we'll flow seamlessly into the question and answer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice-Chancellor. When Richard called me about this matter as to arouse me from my slumber, I wondered if I could really make any contribution to this thing, but I thought about it. And listening to this lecture this evening, which is excellent to give us an appreciation, I came to the conclusion that it is something we ought to pay more attention to. Within recent years, we have had a rather low profile as Jamaica in foreign affairs, at any rate in comparison to the high water mark of the 1970s. But we have to keep reminding ourselves, paraphrasing John Donne, that although we are very much an island, we are not an island entire of ourselves. So we have to understand what's going on in the world. And in the case of Russia, I can think of 3 good reasons. 1, point made, it's a major military power, and even more importantly, one of the 2 major arsenals of nuclear power in the world. And so our interest, it's indeed the rest of the Caribbean, the High Commissioner of Trinidad and Tobago is here. We have to do what we can to ensure stability in these matters as our contribution as one of the nations in the world. And we are proud to say we have actually been elected to the Security Council twice in our history. And so we have that responsibility beyond ourselves. But there's another interest, is the implications for us. Now, Derek will recall our meeting in April 1979, led by Mr. Manley, the late Michael Manley on our side, and the late Alexei Kosygin, then Premier of the Soviet Union, with whom we had 2 long sessions. He made several observations, some of which I would not say at this time. One was to request Manley to use his influence as one of the acknowledged leaders of the Third World to persuade his colleagues at a non-aligned meeting scheduled for Havana later that year to put pressure on the United States to conclude the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty number 2, SALT II was one. And the second, more general point he made, and I think that Professor Hanson touched on it in passing, was that the Soviet Union was very sensitive about its borders, given its experience of invasions. And I must say frankly, I do not think this is a matter which has been given sufficient attention by the West. He touched on it briefly when he mentioned they're concerned about the expansion of NATO and the borders. And you will recall Derek Kosygin spent quite a bit of time giving us the experience. He said some left faster than they came, but as we know, not in all cases, because the Nazi invasion was quite terrible. A second issue why a lecture like this is relevant from our perspective is the role of Russia in the international oil markets. And although we here in Jamaica have been taking steps to reduce our dependence of oil, it has largely been about electricity generation. We still consume 6 million barrels per annum for transportation. And I don't believe that replacing gasoline for motor vehicles is going to happen very quickly. And therefore, it makes a big difference whether Russia and other oil producers' behavior in the market leads to a price of $50 a barrel or $75 for our fragile economy. The third, and not the least, of course, is the fact that the Soviet Union and later Russia have been involved in our major non-service industry, bauxite and aluminum, for close to 40 years. Since we went there in 1979, it's almost 40 years. I hope we remember that. Indeed, it was the sale of alumina which was one of the principal reasons which took us to Moscow in the first place. And Manley succeeded in getting a firm commitment, which for one reason or the other was converted into a bauxite rather than alumina contract and was quite lucrative. And it would have been extended had not the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But currently, UC Rusal, controlled by Oleg Deripaska, one of the oligarchs who is quite close to the Kremlin, I'm sure you would tell us, at one stage was responsible for 60% of all alumina production in Jamaica. Recently, they sold a major plant to Chinese interests. But even then, they are responsible for one production unit, which in normal times contributes some $150 million a year of gross export earnings, which is by no means a non-significant portion of our total exports. To sum up, therefore, monitoring developments within and surrounding Russia is very important for us as a country from the perspectives of peace and stability in the international order, energy, and the local bauxite and alumina industry. So let me congratulate the University of West Indies for bringing on this distinguished and very knowledgeable gentleman to tell us something that we ought to know about a country that is important to us in these areas. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Hanson. I can't recall hearing an analysis about Russia and indeed the Soviet Union that has been so objective. Usually, what clearly emerged is a bias. And I think that what your presentation this afternoon have made an attempt to present the facts for us to draw conclusions. Our association and more intimate knowledge of the Soviet Union then started in the 1970s here, when the then regime, our regime, was attempting really not to embark on being converted to communism, but to seek other markets while still retaining our traditional friends. But our traditional friends interpreted what was being attempted as entirely guided by ideology, and that it was an attempt for us now to add to Cuba next door as a sphere of influence in the region. And as Carlton pointed out, Jamaica at the time had an extremely high rating, way above its size, in terms of the way in which other countries viewed us and our ability, if we were friends, to be able to articulate their position using our influence. And that is a fact that some of us tend to forget. A part of the analysis that you did this afternoon, however, I didn't make reference to the role of Comecon, which was the sort of common market of the Soviet Union. We were at first attempting to see how we could trade with Comecon. But on the advice of the Cubans, and in fact, the Cubans gave us a lot of advice. I was leading the first official delegation, and you would be amazed at some of the advice that they gave us. Very practical, a lot of it not for publication, but in terms of their own experiences in dealing with the Soviet Union. And one of the things they told us was that you don't just go and start trading with Comecon. You have to develop a pattern of trade with a member, and then that member would recommend you to the rest. I mentioned Comecon because what has happened now is that most of those members are now part of the European Union. And clearly, one can see the problem that Mr. Putin now has in terms of trying to rebuild what existed before, certainly in terms of influence with other countries, that those countries are no longer in his sphere of influence and are now part of the European Union. And it is my little analysis that shows that what was happening in the Ukraine was really an attempt to get the Ukraine into the European Union, and he at the same time, not wanting to see his objective become as more diluted, was seeking to ensure that that didn't happen. So that what is still prevailing, and this is what I'm trying to get at, that he, in addition to the various things that you have indicated, that is part of his objective in ensuring that the regime as it existed then is trying to see how it can be resuscitated. Hence his problems with borders. Central Asia is a bit of a problem in that there are problems there with the religion, which is fomenting difficulties for him. His attempt to try to influence elections is nothing new for anybody, including the victim in this particular case. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that there have been tampering with elections all over the world, and indeed in some instances. And I remember Chile, where the elections was attempted to be tampered with, and then it went a certain way that you then sent in the troops. So I believe that what is now happening and what you have indicated, the use of cyber is a new weapon for him, which he is choosing to use effectively to achieve what had been routine in the past in certain countries. And to now pick on the big United States of America to try to influence change there is unique and different. But it is only different to the extent that it is another country, and indeed the United States. My own view, and I recall having gone to the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. And then I went back about 5 or 6 years ago. And I wondered because I saw all these Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs. And one understood the extent to which what Putin may really be aiming to achieve, the extent to which it has been impacted on negatively with what you have pointed out about the oil price, and indeed the absence of a large enough grouping which would have made his empire as powerful as it needs to be in his view to contribute to his patrimony. And I believe that one of the things that is currently taking place is to ensure that the sanctions and the oil prices, which are the two Achilles' heels that are now putting him in a position where the economy is not in a state to assist him in his objectives, unlike the Chinese, who have, and they are focusing, and I was amazed to hear the president of China at the recent conference become the main architect of the free market system. And he is speaking about, because he realizes the influence that he currently has and is likely to have in the very near future because of the economy. And Putin's objectives is going to be severely hampered by the state of the economy in Russia. And so we here in Jamaica, we have a lot to learn, and we need to keep our eyes on what is happening, because it is likely to have an impact on us. To what extent he is going to be able to influence what happens in our big neighbor to the north is of interest to us. And we need to ensure that we have the proper understanding. And your lecture this afternoon has provided us with information that will guide us in having the proper understanding as to what really exists. Thank you very much.
The Vice-Chancellor put this issue in context at the very beginning. Professor Hanson has provided us with a very lucid exposition of an analytic model that can help us to understand Russia, which for most people has been and continues to be an enigma. And Ambassadors Davis and Heaven have outlined, first of all, the relevance of this type of discourse and the need for us as small developing countries in the Caribbean to understand these changes which are taking place in significant countries in the international arena. But secondly, the reason Jamaica may have batted above its weight or boxed above its weight is because of the caliber of its representation by people like Ambassadors Davis and Heaven. I'd like now to open the floor for questions. There are mics available. I would ask you, since we are taping and filming this, that you just identify yourself briefly and ask a question rather than make an extended comment. I'd like to ask the VC to lead us off.
Thank you so very much. I would like to ask a question and make a statement. Through the eyes of the historian and through the eyes of a Pan-Africanist, which has not been the subject of the conversation as yet. Going into the 20th century, after the Second World War, 99% of the black countries of the world are colonized. Maybe 99% of all black people outside of the US are living in a colonial situation. It doesn't look as if the West, that had colonized this entire continent and its people for 500 years, has an interest in changing that. So deep into the 20th century, there could have been the continual colonization of Africa and so on. Enters the Soviet Union and says, we are going to end this 500-year history. And the Soviet Union commits to the destruction of colonization in Africa. Now, over in the US, they are assassinating all the major black leaders. Over in Africa, the Soviet Union is giving them arms, training their armies, and funding them. So one can say that if there is a primary factor in the 20th century decolonization of Africa and the rise of African nation states, was the intervention of the Soviet Union in the affairs of the world, from our perspective. Now, what is the legacy of that in Russia today? When Putin, of course, this is before Putin's time, China has now become the critical global force in many of those countries that Russia liberated. Is it that Putin has retreated from any interest in Africa? And if Russia has retreated from a policy in Africa that was nation building in the Soviet era, is it true to argue, therefore, that his interests through his relationship with Trump, however problematic that might be, is leading towards a consolidation of a Western European white supremacy structure in which Russia and the US then find themselves into a relationship that will shape global ethnic politics going forward, forcing the Chinese and everyone else to find a space within what could be a reconstitution of global white supremacy, with centers in Moscow, Washington, leaving the other countries to deal with a 21st century that sees the world reconstructed along a North Atlantic power axis from Moscow all the way down to LA. Thank you.
So that question definitely has a lot of elements I'd like to talk about. I'll do my best to do it synthetically. The first point is, of course, the Soviet Union did play the crucial role in pushing anti-imperialist movements in the Cold War period. And it did so in the way I described. There was true belief that there was an alternative to imperialism, as it was called, and that was some version of communism. Now, what people meant by that could vary, and people could put their own spin on it. I mean, the Castros obviously put a different spin on it than, say, Ho Chi Minh. But in common, there was a notion that the Soviet Union was some kind of liberator against the colonial and neo-colonial West. That also allowed the non-aligned movement, which was mentioned, to play a crucially important role in, even if you didn't go all the way to becoming a kind of aligned state with the Soviet Union, or having a country of socialist orientation, as the jargon was at the time, you could be, part of the Bandung process, and you could stand against both the West and the Soviet bloc, and that gave some autonomy for countries throughout the world. But I have to add that the Soviet Union was in a very problematic position itself because it had its imperial element too. And vis-a-vis Central Asia, vis-a-vis the Caucasus, vis-a-vis Ukraine, Baltic states later, it very much was an imperial entity, and that was understood. The problem ideologically was how could you portray yourself as the liberator of imperialized, colonized peoples around the world at the same time as you basically treated your Central Asian hinterland pretty much as a metropole would treat the colony, using it for cotton production, not quite slavery, but labor that was severely repressive, and take the proceeds to earn hard currency in the West, which was done both in Ukraine and, for example, Uzbekistan for many decades. And the peoples of those non-Russian areas of the Soviet Union will tell you this was always a fake. They claimed to be anti-imperialist, but when it came to our own, imperial backyard, they were anything but. Now, of course, the argument was always made, we're different because we're Marxist-Leninist, so it's the progressive force of humanity. It's not an imperial power like Europe. But you can understand how somebody in the system might see it quite differently. And that was a tension throughout the Soviet period. Even Gorbachev was wrestling with it. One reason why Gorbachev wanted to create more autonomy for the various nationalities in the Soviet Empire was to get rid of that imperial component and make socialism feel more voluntary and therefore more attractive, including in the developing world. Unfortunately, by giving more autonomy to Ukraine or Kazakhstan or the Baltic states at that point, you were basically destroying the empire completely. And he was sort of naive about how quickly that would unravel. Let me fast forward to Putin, because your point is very important on two levels. One is Putin would love to be the person Brezhnev was, let's say, in the 1970s. He would love to be at the kind of center of a public opinion that was anti-neoliberalism. And he positions himself like that from time to time. But he can't do it, partly for the reasons the ambassador said, which is the economic might is just nowhere near what the Soviet Union was in the context of the mid-20th century. Although Russia is an important power, it doesn't have an attractive model that even a country like India could emulate for many decades and do so plausibly, or that China could emulate. So people may come to Putin for oil bargains, or they may come to talk about aluminum deals, but they're not going to come and say, Russia, we need the answer on how to overcome neoliberalism. And it's a source of real problematic self-identity in Putin's Russia, because there still is a notion, we're at the center of something. People should be coming and talking to us more. The second point you make about white supremacy is fascinating. I think the notion that Trump might represent something like, say, Le Pen in France, or Wilders in Netherlands, or any group of populists you can think of who play on racial and ethnic resentment as a way of building authority, and patrimonial authority in particular, by the way. That alliance was definitely in the minds of certain advisors, but the reality is too complicated for that, because even Trump, coming in, suddenly finds himself with a pretty normal Secretary of Defense and a pretty normal now National Security Advisor. And, here's something to watch on the question of whether there can be any access of the sort that you were describing, is a decision just today I was reading about, which is that the ExxonMobil has asked for an exception to the sanctions regime to work with Rosneft, the state oil company in Russia, to explore Black Sea oil deposits. And if they get an exception, especially with the former CEO of ExxonMobil, now the Secretary of State, that will tell you that even people don't care anymore about the perception right? Because Senator McCain has said, "Are you crazy?" in a tweet that he gave today. We have a lot of profound opposition to that kind of move. My bet is, as I gesture too wildly, my bet is that they will not actually waive the sanctions in that case. It'll be too politically damaging to do it. And then Russia will conclude, as they already have with the Syria situation, any kind of proto-alliance of that sort they thought they might strike won't be struck because the complex of institutions underneath it just doesn't allow for that. I guess that's good news.
Any of the discussants can also respond to the question.
Just a few. What you said sound more like something I read Kissinger saying many years ago that he saw, well, maybe in his 90s now he may have matured, but he didn't see us, our world, as a part of the show, and that sounded. But the point about economic strength, you know, at one stage, I remember the last time I was there when it was still the Soviet Union, a fellow from the economics ministry was giving us example of the things the Soviet Union did in developing countries. 5 million tons worth of coal capacity, 13 million tons of iron ore capacity, 16 million tons of steel capacity, 13 million tons of rolled ferrous metals, 23 million tons of oil capacity, and so on. Frankly, and those are in rubles, but I think at time the ruble was as big as a dollar, wasn't it? I think as big as a dollar. I don't think the wherewithal is there in economic terms. And I think the best example of that is that the subsidy to Cuba in Soviet times was something in the order of $10 million a day. Cash and kind, you know, cash and kind. $10 million a day. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was zilch. It was zilch.
I think that is very important. And again, I like to repeat my story of advice I got from the Cubans. When we were going about with trade with the Soviet Union, and the then Minister of the Economy and the Finance Minister said to me, listen, make sure you get paid in US dollars because we have so much rubles we don't know what to do with it. But, yes.
Which we did.
But, Vice-Chancellor, you made mention of something which a lot of people are a little reluctant to discuss, and it's the whole issue of race. And part of the reason why the Soviet Union and China had a problem was that Khrushchev used to refer to Mao Zedong in racist terms, and it created significant difficulty. What is happening now, and it is part of what one can understand the reasoning as to why the race issue has now come back to the fore. And if you look at the sort of alliances being forged, you will see that that is very topical. The other issue, of course, has to do with the way the Chinese are now operating based on their capacity to do so because of their economy's strength. And what is happening in Africa, the Chinese have replaced the Soviet influence in certain areas, and even in our region. Because I can tell you, I was at a conference last year where the Cubans presented a proposal for their sugar industry. And the country that they kept referring to every step of the way were the Chinese. And so the Chinese are replacing the Soviets in terms of influence because of the strength of their economy and their capacity to be able to enter into arrangements without some of the constraints that may have been inhibiting the type of relationship that some of us would like to see, like some of the political considerations as to why you can't get a loan unless certain things happen. And so it's very important to understand that Putin's handicap to his patrimony is going to be his inability to be able to do these things which really matter to countries like us. And so the Soviet influence, the Russian influence on us, what is it that Russia now is able to do for us? And we are naturally looking at things from this perspective. The bauxite deal, and that by itself has gone a little sour, Carlton. So what? What is it the Chinese have been able to do for us? And I won't discuss sugar, but there are issues there which they are doing for us, cheap money, long term. And so Putin is going to find it very difficult in the current dispensation to be able to fulfill some of the things that he would like his patrimony to reflect. And we at the same time need to recognize that his attempts now at alliances, the extent to which he needs those alliances to put him in a position to further enhance what he would like to leave behind. I believe that it is very important, Professor Hanson, that what you have done this afternoon is a precursor to us understanding really what is likely to happen down the road. And unless we have that sort of background, we are going to end up again making the mistakes that we have made in the past.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions as a group and then ask the panel to respond. The mics are available. Mr. Sharp, I've never known you to attend anything and not ask a question. Could you identify yourself? Please identify your affiliation as well.
Gleaner Group, sir, but representing JNN tonight. Professor Hanson, thanks. But help me. The U.S. also had a bogeyman in the Soviet Union. We're getting the sense that there is an appeasement now. There's a love up, if you may, a little problem now with all that's going on with investigations. Is it that the Americans, not Trump, the Americans have gotten soft on the on Russia? It's no longer a problem. Is it a question that they're getting a pass through Trump? I used to think that once you mention the word Russia, you don't mention it in the houses, but now it seems so easy. Help me with that.
Another question? Identification, please. You are?
Let me give you this one, sir.
I'm Ian Forrest. I'm here in the PVC Global's office at the university. Before the Make America Great Again campaign, Putin seemed to have at his back, and you alluded to this, a Make Russia Great Again campaign. One could say for a significant time he achieved this. But it wasn't Make Russia Great Again in the context that we had come used to it being, sponsoring revolution all over the world. even in good times, as we now talk about a failing economy in Russia, what seems to be Putin's focus seems to be very internal and very limited. And I'm kind of struggling with that. Make Russia great again inside of Russia, and to states and places means a deal, or do we go after the world as was the case only? We seem to live in a tripolar world now, with the Chinese in their ascendancy. I kind of wonder what then does a Putin-Russia strategy see itself as doing, just having big guns and, saber rattling, that kind of thing. What is the differences and doing? And the whole destabilization in the United States, how does that benefit Russia? And in terms of this Truman that we talked about, how does Putin benefit?
Well, that's like 3 questions in one. One more? Okay, well, let's have some responses to those questions.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
And it ended up being 4 questions anyway, so that worked out. So let me first talk about, you're absolutely right, of course, that Russia was, or the Soviet Union was a bogeyman for the U.S. is also true. Both sides have had that relationship in the past. What is interesting about American public opinion now is that it's not the hot button issue that it was. And one big reason for that is 25 years have passed and it wasn't a hot button issue. I mean, as I started the whole lecture with, people really didn't pay that much attention to post-Soviet Russia for the last 25 years. And as we get older, we realize the new generation, 25-year-olds in the US today don't remember a Soviet Union, they don't remember a Cold War, their parents might talk about it. I had a very interesting conversation with a Trump supporter at a bar near Williamsburg. Occasionally we, have a beer. And I was talking with this woman, my wife was with me, and she'd a strong supporter of Trump, who of course was saying nice things about Putin all during the campaign, and she was clearly confused. So I started talking to her about what I do at William & Mary. I said, I'm a Russia specialist, and she said, well then, maybe you can help me understand. I mean, Putin, he's a good man, right? Which was so weird because, forever in American culture, especially on the right, you would never have had this question about a Russian leader. But she was sort of struggling. She didn't want to say Putin was a good man, but she thought maybe he was because, after all, Trump liked him. And so I was trying to say, so I tried to figure out what to say that would translate. And my answer was, well, if your goal is liberty, he's probably not the best choice, which I thought was a way of kind of spinning it, somehow that would be an acceptable answer. By the way, I'm not criticizing this individual. People shouldn't spend all their life studying politics unless it's their profession. It's a dismal science. So normal people don't. But that is my point, because normal people don't pay that much attention. If it's not a hot button issue, if it's not in the newspaper, if it's not taught that much at the universities or the regular schools, people do forget over time. And so now all of those things you used to be able to press the button, and get people all riled up because Russia did X, Y, or Z, not the case. Here's one last thing I'll say about that. It's fascinating. Hillary Clinton, against Donald Trump, should have, one would think, gone to Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, other upper Midwest states, and played the ethnic card. It used to be done all the time in American politics. You'd go to the Baltic community or the Polish community or the Slovak community, and you'd say, do you want the big bad Russia back because that guy Trump keeps talking about Putin as a great guy? Never used that argument. Somehow she forgot to do it. Maybe it would have worked. Maybe if you tried hard, you could have kind of resuscitated all of those anxieties. But it's fascinating that it didn't even occur to people to do it. So my answer is yes, it has changed. On the other questions, which are all fantastic, what is Putin's plan to make Russia great again? I'm glad you didn't ask me what Trump's plan for America was. It's not outside my expertise. But for Russia, it is a little hard to pin down. Now, let me start by pointing out something I probably should have said more in the lecture. It came out implicitly. From 2000 to 2010, Russia's economic performance was great. Putin actually promised that the Russian GDP would double in 10 years when he came to office, and it did. I mean, imagine that kind of a promise. We're going to have double the GDP, and it happens. True, mostly driven by oil and gas prices that skyrocketed just coincidentally when Putin came to office, after Yeltsin was suffering through really low oil prices. But despite that luck, he was a person who could say, Now we got the Mercedes in town. We've got the buildings rebuilt. They're repainted. They're parks. There's a lot of money. People who go to Russia and have only been there in the 90s or earlier, they really miss this transformation, which is so dramatic. Every Russian feels it. And so, of course, Putin was fabulously popular if you take a country in that kind of economic disaster, and it's restored to that level. So that's part of the making Russia great again, is just the economy is back. But the harder part, as many have been talking about, is the foreign policy dimension. What does it mean to have Russia be a great power today? And I think the answer there is, I said myself, more patrimonial in the traditional sense. It's not charismatic. So the reason there's no effort to promote revolutions around the world or have parties that are pro-Russian in different countries, including in the Caribbean, is that there is no messianic vision of how the world could be transformed through Russian leadership. Nothing like Marxism-Leninism with its goals of complete transformation. And so for the same reason, there's no pro-Putin party in every country trying to emulate Russia. I said that already. So what you have instead is an assertion of past imperial greatness, of the more traditional czarist variety. The Crimea, of course, was part of the Russian Empire, and it was even part of Russia in the Soviet period until 1954, by the way. It was given over to Ukraine by Khrushchev as a birthday present to Ukraine, as he called it, in honor of the anniversary of Ukrainian and Russian union. And so Russians say, well, you know, at least we got Crimea back. That's another part of making Russia great again that's very popular in Russia. The phrase in Russian is Krim nash, which just means Crimea is ours. That slogan was everywhere for the first couple of years after the annexation. And my friends in Russia, who are typically fairly liberal type of people, they also will say, you know, we don't like Putin, we don't like the autocracy, but Krim nash, you know, at least we got Crimea back. And that's an assertion of national power against all of the forces which seem to be going against Russia for all of those decades, which seem to be potentially threatening the dismemberment of Russia itself. But beyond that, he doesn't have any idea. I mean, you already see in Ukraine and Syria, and this is the last point, that this vision of making Russia great again by having a kind of traditional empire runs aground on the realities of 21st century geopolitics. You can take Assad and say he's a protector of Christians in Syria, he's a protector of Russian-speaking people in Syria, of whom there are a number. He will guarantee our military bases in Syria, which are the most important in the Middle East, and he's our guy. But that doesn't mean you're going to solve the problem of the Syrian civil war that way. And when you've got so many powerful players, including the United States and Turkey and the Kurds and Iran, you've got a mess on your hands when you intervene. It was predictable, and many did predict. Syria and Ukraine have ended up in the same place, which is stalemates where Putin has lost people, has lost money, is stuck, can't go any further. And so there is another question in whether there's some life to this imperial project beyond just invading close-by neighbors that are already very weak, which doesn't do much, and getting stuck in things overseas you can't really control.
Professor, just before we close, as you know, we are filming and taping this, and it's going to go not only to a wider Caribbean audience, but to the rest of the world. I sense that there's a question that everybody wants to hear your comment on, which is, given the recent difficulties between Putin and Trump and between the US and Russia, the investigations, etc., in the short run, the next year or two, where do you see this relationship going? Is it going to be explosive? Is there going to be appeasement? Is it going to be conflict? Or is it going to be collaboration?
Thank you for that last question, because it gives me an opportunity to add a couple points that are important here. One is the question was asked, why intervene in the US election, which did happen, you know, to the extent that hacking matters and you can release certain emails from people on the Democratic side that are embarrassing. You know, that definitely occurred. Those are facts. Well, there are really two reasons to do it, maybe three. One is NATO expansion, the second is sanctions. Those are the two big ones. If you can get NATO to stop working, that's a huge victory for Russia. And if you can confuse all the NATO members, especially the United States, about the value of the alliance and its importance, then it may disintegrate because it requires a kind of confidence on the part of even Estonia, let's say, that, you know, the border of Estonia and Russia in principle will be defended by Americans if push comes to shove. That is critical to the alliance's functioning. And if you kind of get people confused about it, then it stops working. And on sanctions, the same story. If you can get people to say, well, yes, there was an illegal annexation of Crimea, invasion of eastern Ukraine, but now it's been a few years, and after all, it was kind of ambiguous where the borders were, and we should drop the sanctions, then further sanctions against Russia will be impossible. There's already so many economic interests in Europe and the US that are trying desperately to get rid of them, that kind of transatlantic solidarity would disintegrate quickly. So you intervene in the elections, not just to get Trump in, which might be part of your goal, but because you want to weaken the solidarity around those two basically anti-Russian measures, if you look at it from Putin's point of view. The other, third reason, of course, is just to make it look like democracy is fake everywhere, right? If you say democracy is fake in Russia and all the other democracies look great, this was a problem with Obama's election. It was not predicted in Russia. It was quite a shock that President Obama won. They all expected Hillary Clinton to win in 2008. And then they could just say, look at your fake democracy. We have Clinton dynasty, we have Bush dynasty. They repeat over and over again, same elite all the time. Suddenly, Barack Obama, comes out of the blue from their point of view and wins not one but two elections. And that changed the narrative. It made it harder to make the case that our democracy was so fake after all. But now, if you say, look at all the mess with the American electoral system, look at all these controversies, no one can trust the ballot, that helps to confuse the waters. So what is the path forward, to actually answer the question in the last minute here? It is very, very tricky terrain, to be sure. The early hopes, and we talked about this at the beginning, of maybe some kind of actual alliance or at least understanding in a kind of populist, even racist form, which I think was there in some quarters. That's been dashed. If you look at the Russian media today, there's very little pro-Trump anything. If anything, it's a lot of anti-Trump. And the Syrian intervention against Assad was played up in Russian television as a terrible betrayal. They kind of use old Marxist-Leninist arguments. They say the military-industrial complex of the imperialist powers are too strong, and so they always assert themselves even when there are people trying to change it. Trump tried, but he failed. So those kinds of arguments are out there. But nobody really suspects in Putin's elite that Trump is going to be able to bring back a kind of overtly pro-Russian policy. What's more interesting to watch is the question of inadvertent conflict. And that can happen in Syria. So the biggest danger from my point of view, there's probably two. One is the Syrian conflict just accidentally could involve some exchange of fire between the Russian forces and the American forces directly. In the recent strike, the Americans warned the Russians that was coming because Russians were on the base that was being struck. They evacuated, but they, after that, announced they were no longer going to keep lines of communication open for deconflicting the overflights of the various Syrian theaters. The problem with that is if two planes come and crash, or if somebody bombs the other person's troops and it becomes a popular issue in Russia and the United States, this could be extremely difficult to pull back. North Korea, the other one, that is an issue where heightened rhetoric can lead to unexpected results in China, Russia, North Korea, and the rest of the world. And the final thing is France. I forgot to say, do watch Sunday's election in France, because it looks for the time being that the sort of, in a way, neoliberal forces are coalescing again and the old alliances are being reformed in the West. But it's possible if Le Pen actually wins in the second round that you would have a radical reversal toward a more populist result that would break up the European Union and NATO predictably. It could actually really do that. And then all bets are off for how this kind of relationship would develop after that. So definitely we're studying Russia.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have to bring this to a close.
Thank you very much.
I know I stand between you and the refreshments, but there are some obligatory things that I have to do. One I happily do, which is I'd like to thank the VC for initiating this very informative forum and for enriching the discussion with his own comments. I thank you, Professor. We had our own long one bilateral this morning for an hour, and I thank you because you not only provided one, information on what's happening, which is not always easily available to us from objective sources, but secondly, you have left us with a tool, an analytic model, which we can continue to use to analyze events, and we thank you for that. I thank our discussants, Ambassadors Davis and Heaven. They have made the Caribbean connection and they have enriched it with their own experiential and historic involvements in these things. I thank the audience for the questions and for attending. And I am obliged to do a few housekeeping things. First of all, I thank the organizing committee. I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. If I leave out anyone, please don't take offense. The organizing committee, particularly Shakira Maxwell, I thank UWI TV, the caterers, we have used them several times, so I can thank them in advance because I know what to expect. The facilities management, especially Mr. Plunkett and Mrs. Francis, the Department of Government, who I didn't discern, but I'm sure they're here in spirit. Marcia, oh, wonderful. Could you stand and be recognized? Government Department. Okay. Thank you. Marcia Erskine and her associates, UWI Marketing and Communications, members of the planning team, the ushers from the Department of Government, the audience, thank you all very much. I now invite you to continue the discussion after we have presented you with a small gift.
Well, can I just say, while the gift may be coming, that I am so honored to be on this very distinguished panel with such wonderful civil servants of Jamaica. And it is an experience of a lifetime to be able to share the stage with you both, and all three of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is what, I mean, for example, do you get the impression it's almost like Jamaica has resigned from foreign policy?
Small token of our appreciation, knowing that you're a historian, this presents the history of our glorious institution, of which you are now part of the extended family. Thank you so much.
And knowing that the world will be fancy. Disaster.
I sometimes, I find that out.
It means that they don't.
In closing, let me just invite everyone to join us for refreshments and to continue the discussion in a more intimate setting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again. It was really fun. I enjoyed your comments immensely.
Excuse me, if you could just, sorry, excuse me, if you just could just go around and shake that hand.
Get the VC in the picture too.